My name is Mario Salazar, or at least that was the name of the man I once was. A man who inhabited a world built on pillars of logic, ethics, and the firm conviction that reason could illuminate the darkest corners of the human soul. My life was a sanctuary of academic tranquility in Mexico City, a haven of chalk and knowledge where I, as a philosophy professor, guided young minds through the labyrinths of thought from Plato to Kant. I fervently believed in order, in dialogue, and in the inherent capacity of human beings to choose good. But before I dive into the hell that my life became, I ask for your help in telling this story. Subscribe to this channel, we're almost hitting the goal of 1,000 subscribers, and comment which city you're listening from. Your strength gives me the courage to continue, to ensure that other voices are not silenced like my family's was. My universe was not defined just by books, but by the warmth of a home overflowing with love. Elena, my wife, was the melody that gave rhythm to my days, an architect with a smile capable of redesigning my world. And Sophia, our little 6-year-old, was the light, the living proof of all the goodness I theorized about in the classroom. Her colorful drawings covered the refrigerator like masterpieces in a sacred museum, and her laughter was the only argument I needed to believe in perfection. Every morning, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sound of her little feet running through the house, creating a symphony of happiness that I, in my naive intellectual arrogance, believed to be eternal and unshakable. It was a simple life, woven with the threads of routine and affection, and for me it was paradise itself. Mexico City for me was a divided concept. There was my city, the university, the cozy bookstores, the parks where Sophia learned to ride a bike, the cafes where I debated philosophy with colleagues. And there was the other city, the one from the newspaper headlines and the nightly news, a distant place of violence and cartels that I addressed in my classes as an abstract social problem, a symptom of a flawed system that could be analyzed and eventually corrected by reason. I lived in a bubble of intellectual privilege, protected by the walls of academia and by the false security that barbarism was something that happened to others, in a parallel reality that would never cross the threshold of my door. That perception was my greatest mistake, a catastrophic failure of analysis that would cost me everything. I remember one of my last classes. The topic was the nature of justice and the legitimacy of revenge. I argued with the passion of a convinced academic that revenge was a poison, a primitive act that only perpetuated the cycle of violence, corroding the soul of the one who seeks it. True justice, I argued to an audience of attentive young people, is impersonal, rational, and seeks the restoration of order, not the satisfaction of a thirst for blood. To surrender to revenge is to allow the monster you hunt to transform you into a reflection of itself. A student questioned me about the failure of the system, the corruption. I answered with the confidence of someone whose faith had never been tested, speaking about the importance of strengthening institutions. Little did I know that soon my words would turn to ash in my mouth, a cruel irony that would haunt me forever. That night, normality was so palpable, it was almost banal. The smell of cilantro and lime from the dinner Elena prepared still lingered in the air. I helped Sophia with her homework about the stars, explaining constellations with the patience of a father who sees the universe in his daughter's curious eyes. Later, we read her favorite book, a story about a brave rabbit who saved his friends in the forest. She fell asleep in my arms, her face serene, like someone who knows no evil. I put her to bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered that I loved her more than all the stars in the sky. That little ritual, repeated so many times, would become the most precious and painful memory, the last fragment of a world about to be annihilated. While my family slept, the world I ignored moved through the city's shadows. Somewhere, in a smoke-filled office or a filthy warehouse, orders were given by men whose faces I didn't know, whose lives were governed by a logic of power and brutality that I only understood in theory. The machinery of the La Sombra cartel turned, indifferent to my existence, moving its pieces on a bloody chessboard. A wrong address, a piece of misinformation, a simple twist of fate was enough for their path to collide with mine. The violence I treated as a case study was on its way to my house, not as a hypothesis, but as a force of nature, blind and devastating. The last conversation I had with Elena was about the future. Sitting on the couch, with the city lights shining in the distance through the window, we planned our summer vacation. She wanted to go to the beach, build sand castles with Sophia. I agreed, smiling at the image in my mind. We talked about our dreams, about growing old together, about the incredible person our daughter would become. Her hand found mine, a familiar gesture that was the anchor of my existence. There was a peace in that moment, a deep stillness that seemed to promise an infinity of nights like that one. It was the last time I felt peace. The last time happiness was something real and not just a ghostly memory that both drives and tortures me. The silence of the early morning was my companion as I graded some student papers in the living room. The house was asleep. The street was deserted. It was the calm interlude between a happy day and the dawn of another. But a sound broke that stillness, a sound that did not belong to my world. The sound of shattering glass. My heart stopped. The blood froze in my veins. The philosophy professor, the man of reason, disappeared in that instant, replaced by a primitive instinct of fear and protection. The other Mexico City was no longer in the headlines. It was in my living room. The monster was no longer a theory. It had broken down my door, and I was about to discover that hell was not a metaphysical concept, but a real place, about to be inaugurated in my own home. The sound of shattering glass was followed by the violent breaking of the front door, which splintered inward as if struck by a supernatural force. 3 shadowy figures, silhouettes cut against the faint streetlight, invaded my home. They were men who moved with predatory precision, their faces hidden by the darkness, but their intentions were crystal clear. Panic paralyzed me for a fraction of a second before paternal instinct took absolute control. I placed myself between them and the hallway leading to the bedrooms, my hands raised in a universal gesture of peace, the only weapon I possessed. I tried to speak, to articulate words of reason. "There's been a mistake," I said, my voice a trembling thread of logic in the midst of a hurricane of irrationality. "What do you want? We can talk." They laughed, a guttural, dismissive sound that echoed in the sanctuary of my home, mocking my entire life's philosophy. One of them grabbed me, his strength brutal and overwhelming, throwing me against the wall with an impact that knocked the wind out of my lungs. As my face pressed against the cold plaster, I heard a name snarled near my ear. "Where's the merchandise, Fuentes?" The name meant nothing to me. The realization hit me with the force of a punch to the gut. It was a mistake. They weren't there for me. We were just collateral damage in a war that wasn't ours. I tried to scream it, to explain that my name was Salazar, that I was a professor, that they were in the wrong house. But my words were muffled by the pain of a blow to the head. Violence was the only language they spoke, and I was a desperate illiterate, unable to make myself understood as the world collapsed. And then I heard it, the sound that would become the eternal soundtrack to my nightmares. Elena's scream coming from our bedroom, a sound of pure terror that was abruptly silenced. Then a thin, frightened cry from Sophia. "Mommy!" My body twisted in impotent fury, an agony so deep it felt like it was tearing my soul apart. I fought against the man holding me, but I was an academic, a man of words, not of strength. I was useless. I was forced to listen, to imagine the horror unfolding just meters away, each second stretching into an eternity of torture. The silence that followed my daughter's cry was the death sentence for the man I used to be. In that moment, Mario Salazar died, along with his family. They left as suddenly as they arrived, leaving behind a desecrated silence, dense and heavy, with the smell of gunpowder and death. The air was thick with the void left by the souls that had been ripped from my life. It took me an eternity to be able to move, my body screaming in pain, but it was a distant echo compared to the silent scream of my spirit. I crawled down the hallway, past the wreckage of my quiet life, my heart pounding a desperate prayer that it was all just a terrible nightmare. But the sight that awaited me in the bedroom was the confirmation of the cruelest reality. Elena and Sophia, they were lying there, motionless, in a silence that not even the most eloquent of philosophies could explain or justify. The world dissolved into a red haze of indescribable pain. The arrival of the police was a bureaucratic farce, an insult to my grief. While paramedics covered the bodies of my wife and daughter, officers asked cold, impersonal questions. I described the intruders, mentioned the name Fuentes, explained the obvious mistake, but it was when I whispered the name one of them let slip, La Sombra, that the atmosphere changed. Their gazes shifted, their posture became defensive. I saw the truth in their eyes. Fear and resignation. I realized there would be no investigation, no justice. They were pawns in a rotten system, complicit through their silence. At that moment, sitting on the floor of my destroyed home, grief gave way to an icy clarity. Justice would not come from a badge or a courtroom. If the world was ruled by monsters, I would become a monster to hunt them. This is not just my story, it's a cry for all those who have been silenced. By subscribing, you help me give a voice to this fight and ensure that no other family has to go through this. The days that followed the massacre were a blur of callous formalities and a deafening silence. The funeral was a pantomime of mourning, with contrite faces of colleagues and acquaintances who couldn't even scratch the surface of my agony. They offered me condolences and empty clichés, while I only saw the cold earth covering the small coffins that held my entire universe. When I returned to the empty house, the silence was no longer of peace, but of absence. Every corner screamed the memories of Elena and Sophia. It was there, amidst the ghosts of my lost happiness, that the decision solidified. Mario Salazar, the professor, the husband, the father, needed to die so that another man, an instrument of retribution, could be born from his ashes. I would no longer seek justice. I would become justice. The first step was to erase my past. I sold the house, the cars, liquidated investments, turning years of an academic life into piles of anonymous cash. I donated my books, each volume a small paper cut on my old identity, and got rid of all my clothes, except for the most functional. I cut all ties, ignored the worried calls from friends and the university, and simply disappeared. I moved into a tiny, anonymous apartment in the most forgotten and dangerous part of the city, a place where no one asks questions, a concrete nest where I could begin my real work. The peeling walls and the smell of mold were the perfect setting for my new existence, a physical reflection of the decay of my soul. From then on, I was just a shadow. My mind, once dedicated to unraveling the intricacies of ethics and metaphysics, was reconfigured for a single purpose: the annihilation of the La Sombra cartel. I applied academic rigor to the art of vengeance. I spent months in obscure internet cafes, diving into the depths of the dark web, tracing the cartel's hierarchical structure, from its untouchable leaders to its most disposable sicarios. I studied their businesses, their routes, their safe houses. My research was no longer about Kant. It was about ballistics, pressure points, the chemistry of homemade explosives, and human anatomy, with a clinical focus on the most vulnerable points. The intellect I once used to enlighten was now sharpened to become the deadliest of weapons, a scalpel to dissect the organization that destroyed me. The intellectual transformation needed a physical complement. The professor's flabby body gave way to a machine of pain and endurance. My mornings no longer began with the aroma of coffee, but with the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, the result of a brutal, self-directed training regimen. I ran through the streets before dawn, turned the small apartment into a makeshift gym, and punched sandbags until my knuckles bled. The physical pain was a welcome analgesic, a way to silence the incessant screams in my mind. At a clandestine shooting range, I learned to master the recoil of a pistol, to feel its weight as an extension of my will. Every aching muscle, every callus on my hand was a step away from the weak man who couldn't protect his family. With the preparation complete, I was no longer Mario Salazar. I was a predator, a ghost with a singular purpose. I chose my first prey with surgical precision, Javier El Perro Morales, the lowest-ranking sicario, the watchdog who broke down my door. I got his name by blackmailing a small police informant, and his face was seared into my memory. He was the weakest link, the perfect starting point. Tracking him was an exercise in patience. I watched him for weeks, learning his habits. The cheap bar where he drank until he passed out, the mistress he visited on Tuesdays, the dark alley he used as a shortcut home. Every detail was a piece in the mosaic of his destruction, and I reveled in the methodical construction of his end. The hunt consumed me. I followed him like a shadow, invisible, omnipresent. Sitting in my car across the street from his filthy apartment, I watched him live his mediocre and violent life, and the hatred boiled within me. It was a pure, glacial hatred. The man I was, the philosopher who believed in dialogue, watched in horror from some forgotten corner of my consciousness. He screamed, argued that this was wrong, that violence would only beget more violence. But his voice was weak, a whisper drowned out by the roar of my pain and the image of Sophia's terrified face. Every one of Javier's laughs, every sip of beer, was a nail in the coffin of my old morality. He was a breathing monster, and I was the exorcist who would send him back to hell. The night of the reckoning arrived. I waited for him in the dark alley, my heart pounding against my ribs, a mixture of terror and anticipation. When he appeared, staggering drunk, the confrontation was anything but clean. My intention was a quick execution, but the reality was a desperate, dirty fight. He was stronger, more accustomed to violence. We fought in the filth, among trash cans and rats. I managed to disarm him, but the fight became physical, primitive. In a moment of desperation, I used a knife I had bought for that purpose. The feeling of the blade entering flesh, the wet sound, the warmth of blood on my hands. It was horrendous. As he fell, gasping, looking at me with surprise and fear, I watched the last breath of life leave his eyes. And then I vomited, emptying my stomach and my soul. The shock of the act left me trembling in the cold alley. What had I done? I had taken a human life. The weight of that transgression was crushing, a violation of everything I had ever believed in. For an instant, I thought of running, of disappearing, of succumbing to the guilt. But then I closed my eyes and saw Elena and Sophia. I saw their smiles, heard their laughter, and then I saw their motionless bodies. The image reignited the flame. That man on the ground was one of the architects of my pain. His death was not a crime, it was a correction, an equation being balanced. That night, amidst the garbage and death, I accepted the truth. To hunt monsters, I had to become more monstrous than them. That was my true baptism, not in water, but in blood. As I composed myself, in another part of the city, Detective Ana Flores arrived at the crime scene. A career cop with eyes that saw beyond the obvious, she immediately noticed the anomalies. The victim was a known sicario, but the execution didn't have the signature of a cartel hit. It lacked the performative brutality, the message left for rivals. This was different, almost intimate. There was a contained fury, a desperate precision that intrigued her. She saw the scene not as just another body in the morgue, but as the first chapter of a story she couldn't yet decipher. Ana Flores didn't know it yet, But our paths were destined to cross on the trail of blood and vengeance I had just begun to pave. The first kill was a terrible but effective teacher. I learned that proximity was a mistake, that emotion was a weakness. For the second target, one of the other men who invaded my house, the approach was clinical. I used my intelligence to set a trap. I manipulated information, created a fake drug deal, and when he arrived at the arranged location, an abandoned warehouse, a single bullet from a sniper rifle, fired from a building 300 meters away, ended his life. No struggle, no mess, no hesitation. It was clean, efficient, and frighteningly easy. In that moment, I felt the danger of becoming good at this. The Professor, as the media would later nickname me, was beginning to hone his terrible craft. The bodies kept appearing. The third man, the driver from that night, died in a carefully orchestrated car bomb. The fourth, an informant who gave the wrong address, was poisoned in his favorite restaurant. My executions became my signature, methodical, unpredictable, and inescapable. I left no clues, no witnesses. In the underworld, fear began to spread. Whispers arose of a shadow, a ghost hunting the men of La Sombra with an intelligence and cruelty they couldn't comprehend. No one knew my name or my face, but the legend of the Professor began to be told in hushed tones, a boogeyman story for those who once thought themselves untouchable. Ana Flores was obsessed. The murders formed a clear pattern that only she seemed to take seriously. All the victims belonged to the same cell of the La Sombra cartel, the same cell responsible for dozens of unsolved crimes, including a robbery gone wrong at a university professor's home months earlier. The connection hit her like a lightning bolt. She revisited the Salazar case file, read my statement, felt the raw pain in my words. She began to piece together the puzzle, and the picture that formed was of an ordinary man pushed to the extreme, a good man turned into an avenging angel. Her hunt wasn't just to catch a killer, it was to understand the soul of a man the system had failed to protect. My revenge, however, hit a snag. To get to the higher levels of the cartel, I needed information that couldn't be found online. I needed a name, the name of the man who gave the order that night. This led me to kidnap a mid-level lieutenant, a man named Hector Vargas, known for his loyalty and his brutality. I took him to an abandoned basement, a place where the only sounds were the dripping of water and the echo of our voices. He laughed at me, spat in my face, promising his men would hunt me down and make me suffer. He didn't know that I already lived in a hell he couldn't even imagine. The moment that followed would define my soul forever. Torture was the final line I crossed, the point of no return from which I knew I could never come back. There was no rage in my actions, just a cold, calculated procedure. I used the knowledge I had acquired about the human body not to kill, but to inflict precise, unbearable pain, breaking his mind while keeping his body functional. Each of his screams was an echo of my own silent agony. As I worked, I saw the faces of my wife and daughter, and I wondered what they would think of the monster I had become. In the end, with his body broken and his spirit destroyed, Hector gave me the name Ricardo El Espectro Jimenez. He was the boss, the architect of my pain, and in obtaining that information, I sacrificed the last fragment of the man I once was. After Hector gave me what I wanted, the silence in the basement was heavy and accusatory. I looked at my hands, not the hands of a professor who held books, but the tools of a torturer, stained with the cruelty of my purpose. The victory of getting El Espectro's name had the bitter taste of my own damnation. I left him alive, tied up with an anonymous call to the police, not out of mercy, but because killing him seemed irrelevant. The real damage had already been done to me. I walked out of that basement and through the city's night streets, feeling more like a ghost than ever. I had the name of my final target, but at what cost? The question hung over me, but the answer no longer mattered. The path was set. Ana Flores's investigation led her to interview my old colleague and friend, the history professor, Dr. Alves. The conversation took place in my old office at the university, a place that now seemed to belong to another life. Alves described the Mario Salazar he knew, a kind man, a passionate intellectual, a devoted father who debated ethics with fervor. He spoke of my belief in reason, in institutional justice. When Ana suggested the possibility that I was the professor, Alves laughed, a sad, incredulous laugh. "Mario? Impossible," he said. "He wouldn't hurt a fly. The pain broke him, detective. He's not a monster, he's a victim." But even as he said it, a seed of doubt was planted in his mind. The terrible possibility that pain could, in fact, create monsters. At the top of the criminal food chain, Ricardo El Espectro Jimenez finally realized that the attacks on his men were not the work of a rival cartel. They were too personal, too surgical. The audacity and efficiency of the professor infuriated him, but also fascinated him. He who saw himself as the ultimate predator, the invisible spectre who ruled the city, was now being hunted by an even more mysterious shadow. The affront was intolerable. El Espectro wasn't just a criminal, he was a narcissist who reveled in the fear he inspired. The existence of a man who not only didn't fear him, but actively challenged him, became a personal obsession. He wanted the professor's head, not for business, but for pride. El Espectro's response was immediate and overwhelming. He put a multi-million-dollar bounty on my head, mobilizing not only his own men, but every hitman and bounty hunter in the city. My face, or at least a crude sketch of it, was distributed in the underworld. Suddenly, the entire city became a hunting ground, and I was the prey. The anonymity that had been my greatest shield was evaporating. Every face in the crowd was a potential threat, every alley a possible ambush. The game had changed. I was no longer just the hunter. Now I was hunted with the same ferocity with which I hunted, forcing me to dive even deeper into the shadows to survive. My life became a constant exercise in paranoia. I abandoned the apartment, living on the move, sleeping in cheap motels for no more than a night, using disguises, switching stolen vehicles. The city, which was once my chessboard, became a hostile labyrinth. I ate little, slept even less, fueled by a mixture of caffeine, adrenaline, and the inexhaustible fuel of my hatred. Loneliness was a constant companion, a cold weight in my chest. There was no one to trust, nowhere to rest. It was an animalistic existence, reduced to the basic instinct of hunting and not being hunted, a final descent into the darkness I had chosen for myself. The inevitable ambush happened on a rainy night. 3 bounty hunters cornered me in an abandoned parking garage. They were professionals, fast and lethal. The shootout was a blur of muzzle flashes, shattering glass, and the sound of metal tearing through metal. I survived by a thread, using my intelligence to turn the environment into a weapon, creating diversions, using the wreckage as cover. But I didn't escape unscathed. A bullet tore through my shoulder, a sharp, searing pain that reminded me of my mortality. I managed to escape, leaving the 3 dead men behind, but the wound was serious. Bleeding and weakened, I found refuge in a forgotten cargo warehouse, a place to patch myself up and face my own fragility. As I stitched my own shoulder with a stolen suture needle and a bottle of tequila as an antiseptic, the physical pain brought me a terrible clarity. I looked at my reflection in a shard of a broken mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. The eyes were hollow and haunted, the face a mask of exhaustion and fury. The revenge, which had started as a purifying fire, had become an end in itself. It was no longer just about Elena and Sophia. It was about finishing the war I had started. The question of justice had become irrelevant. All that remained was the need to see El Espectro's face, to end the cycle, regardless of what happened to me afterward. Meanwhile, Ana Flores's tenacity led to a breakthrough. Following a lead, She discovered one of my previous hideouts, the apartment I had abandoned. The place was almost empty, but my ghostly presence lingered. On the wall, she found what she was looking for, a detailed map of the La Sombra structure, with faces and names crossed out one by one. And at the center of it all, a red circle around a grainy photo of Ricardo Jimenez. Next to the map, taped to the wall, was the only personal item I had kept, a faded photo of me, Elena, and Sophia, smiling on a sunny day. In that moment, Anna understood. Everything, the entire story was there, on one wall, the pain, the motive, the journey, and she felt a shiver of reluctant sympathy for the monster she was hunting. Using the information I had tortured out of Hector Vargas, I spent the following weeks planning my final move. El Espectro's base of operations was a fortress, an old slaughterhouse on the outskirts of the city, heavily guarded and supposedly impenetrable. I studied the blueprints, the guard patterns, the deliveries. Every detail was analyzed with the precision of a philosopher dissecting an argument. I knew that invading that place was a suicide mission. The chances of getting out alive were almost nil. But death no longer scared me. What scared me was the idea of failing, of letting the man who ordered the destruction of my life continue to breathe. Death would be, at worst, a reunion with the peace that was stolen from me. The time came to make the final decision, the action that would define all my suffering. I looked at the photo of my family one last time. Their smiles were from a world that no longer existed. I whispered an apology to them for becoming the monster I was, but also a promise. It was for them. Everything was for them. If my soul was already lost, let my last act in this world at least bring a semblance of justice to their silence. I put the photo in my pocket, close to my heart. The decision to attack was no longer an impulse of pain. It was a conscious choice, a final act of love and fury. I wonder, if you were in my place, would you have the strength to see it through to the end? Sometimes the support of strangers is the only thing that keeps us from falling apart completely. With the decision made, a strange calm washed over me. The fear was gone, the doubt dissipated. Only purpose remained. I checked my weapons, prepared my improvised explosives, and put on a bulletproof vest under a dark coat. I was the embodiment of my own distorted philosophy, a rational man embracing the most irrational act of all. As I stepped out into the night, heading for the slaughterhouse, the city seemed a blur of neon lights and indifference. I was a ghost, moving through its arteries, on my way to the heart of darkness. I was no longer Mario Salazar, the victim. I was the Professor, the executioner, and the final lesson was about to begin. The slaughterhouse rose against the night sky like a carcass of concrete and rust, a monument to death. The air was heavy, imbued with the ghostly stench of old blood and fear soaked into the walls. I entered through a ventilation duct, a dirty, tight path that an army would never consider, moving with the silence of a plague. Every step inside the fortress was calculated. I used the shadows as my only ally, dodging cameras and bypassing patrols with predatory patience. The logic I once applied to Aristotle was now used to predict the guards' movements, turning the complex into a deadly puzzle. I solved one move at a time. The adrenaline was ice in my veins, the fury, a constant ember warming the emptiness in my chest. I wasn't invading a place. I was entering a tomb, and only one of us would leave. The progression through the labyrinthine corridors was a symphony of silenced violence. There were no extravagant shootouts, just quick, brutal encounters in the gloom. One guard was neutralized with a garrote, his surprised gasp muffled against my shoulder. Two others fell victim to electrical traps I improvised from the building's exposed wiring. I moved like a spectre, the personification of the legend they themselves had created. Every man I took down was a step on the ladder that would lead me to the devil who presided over this hell. There was no more hesitation, no more of the vomiting and trembling from my first kill. All that remained was a cold efficiency, the automation of a man who had become a tool for his own hatred, each death just a means to a terrible and necessary end. Finally, I reached the heart of the slaughterhouse, a vast processing chamber where empty meat hooks hung from the ceiling like metal skeletons. And there, in the center, sitting in a leather armchair that seemed absurdly out of place, was Ricardo El Espectro Jimenez. He didn't look surprised. On the contrary, he was smiling, like a host welcoming an honored guest. In his hands, he held a glass of whiskey, and on a large screen behind him, security camera footage showed my approach. He had been watching me the whole time, turning my hunt into a private spectacle. His last elite guards formed a semicircle around him, but it was clear that this moment was just between the two of us. The trap wasn't meant to kill me, it was meant to receive me. "Professor," he said, his calm, amused voice echoing through the vast space. "I was wondering when you would finally grace my humble home with your presence. I must admit, your methodology is fascinating. The precision, the lack of emotion, it's a work of art." He stood up, walking slowly towards me, the supreme predator who felt no fear, only curiosity. "But look at you," he continued, stopping at a safe distance. "The man of reason covered in blood and grime, using logic to justify barbarism. Don't you see the irony? You hunted me for so long that you ended up becoming me. You just needed a little push, one bad night. Deep down you always had this inside you. I didn't destroy your family, Professor. I just unleashed your true nature." His words were like acid, designed to corrode the foundation of my revenge, to make me believe there was no difference between us. For a moment, the image of Elena and Sophia flashed in my mind, their faces judging me. Doubt struck me, a pang of agony. Could he be right? Was I just another monster? I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and found my voice, a low growl full of pain. "You're wrong," I said, each word weighing a ton. "You kill for power, for greed. You find pleasure in pain. I learned to use the tools of hell, but I did not become one of its demons. You know nothing about the nature of a man who loved something more than his own life. The difference between us is that everything I do in memory of a love you could never be capable of understanding." The tension finally broke. With a nod from El Espectro, his men attacked. What followed was chaos. The chamber turned into a pandemonium of gunshots and screams. I used the metal hooks and machinery carcasses as cover, returning fire with desperate precision. It was my logic against their brute force. One by one, his guards fell, but the fight took its toll. I was hit in the leg, the pain causing me to fall. El Espectro watched it all with an amused smile, until only he remained. Then he drew his own gun and advanced. The final battle was not at a distance. It was a savage hand-to-hand confrontation, two men identical in their capacity for violence, fighting in the dirt and blood, a dark reflection of each other. I managed to disarm him, and the fight became even more primitive. Punches, knees, a desperate attempt at strangulation. He was strong, but I was driven by something he didn't possess, the indelible image of my family. That image gave me the final strength. With one last effort, I gained the upper hand, throwing him against a metal table. His head hit with a hollow thud, and he fell to the floor, stunned and defenseless. I was on top of him, my gun back in my hands, the barrel pressed against his forehead. Our eyes met. In his, I saw no fear, only a mocking challenge. He gave me a bloody smile and whispered, "Do it. Become me." That was the final test. I pulled the trigger, not with anger, but with an absolute emptiness. The sound of the shot echoed in the silent chamber, the final period on a long and terrible sentence. The revenge was complete. Justice, however, had never been so far away. The sound of the shot dissipated, leaving behind a profound silence, heavier than any noise that had ever filled that slaughterhouse. The body of Ricardo El Espectro Jimenez lay inert at my feet, and with his last breath, the fire that had consumed me for so long extinguished, leaving only ashes and an overwhelming cold. I waited to feel something: relief, satisfaction, triumph. But I felt nothing. The grand climax of my journey, the final act that was supposed to bring peace to my tortured soul, was just an empty echo. Revenge, which I had pursued with the devotion of a religious fanatic, revealed itself to be a false god. It gave me a purpose, it kept me alive, but it couldn't heal me. I looked at the face of the man who destroyed my world and saw only a broken reflection of myself, a reminder of the monster I had to become to get there. The victory had the bitter taste of defeat. Staggering, wounded in body and soul, I left that concrete mausoleum and returned to the city. The neon lights that once seemed hostile were now simply indifferent, highlighting my complete and utter loneliness. I had won the war, but I was alone on the devastated battlefield. Every face that passed me on the street was a reminder of a normal life I could never have again. I was a ghost among the living, haunted not only by the faces of Elena and Sophia, but also by the faces of all the men I had killed. I completed my list, crossed off every name, but the only name that mattered, Mario Salazar, had also been crossed off, and there was no way to bring him back. The silence in my heart was the definitive proof that, in destroying my enemies, I had destroyed myself along with them. Somewhere in the city, Detective Ana Flores found the body of Hector Vargas, left as an anonymous gift. With his testimony, the entire corrupt structure of the La Sombra cartel began to crumble. Arrests followed, the media celebrated the fall of a crime empire, and the legend of the Professor was cemented as an enigmatic vigilante who cleaned up the city. They saw me as a symbol of justice, a dark hero. Little did they know that the hero was just an empty man whose only remaining skill was the ability to inflict pain. Ana, in her wisdom, understood the tragedy. She closed the case, declaring the Professor as missing and likely dead in the final confrontation. It was her act of mercy, a silent epilogue to my story, allowing the ghost I had become to finally rest. I disappeared, not in a glorious shootout, but into the anonymous shadows of a distant city, in a country where my name meant nothing. I became an urban legend in Mexico City, a whispered tale to scare criminals. They say a professor, driven mad by grief, still hunts in the shadows, a ghostly protector of the innocent. It's a comforting lie, but the truth is much sadder. I am just a man sitting in a cheap room, staring at a faded photo of a smiling family, trying to remember what it felt like to feel the warmth of the sun or the simplicity of peace. The question that haunts me every night is not whether I did the right thing, but rather, was it worth it? And the answer is a silence that stretches into eternity. My journey ends here, not with an answer, but with a warning about how thin the line is that separates man from monster, and how grief can push us across it. Sharing this story was my final act, my only attempt to find some meaning in the chaos. I thank each of you who listened to my account to the end. Subscribing to this channel and sharing this story is more than a click. It's a way to ensure that the voices of victims like Elena and Sophia continue to echo, reminding us of the price of violence and the fragility of the human soul. Perhaps, by telling my story, I can prevent another heartbroken man from choosing the same dark path I walked. Goodbye.